Welcome to the channel Infidelity Stories. Hi, I'm Camille and I'll tell you my story. I still remember the feel of the warm breeze on my skin, how the sun was setting over the horizon, casting a golden hue over everything it touched. It was one of those perfect days that you believe will last forever. Laurent and I had spent the afternoon by the lake, talking about our future, about dreams and plans that seemed so tangible, so within reach. The kind of dreams you think will last a lifetime, the oak tree by the lake had always been our spot. It had seen us grow together, from shy teenagers to passionate young lovers. I was leaning against the rough bark, while Laurent sat beside me, tracing his fingers along the lines of my palm, as if memorizing every part of me, Camille, he began softly, looking up at me with those emerald green eyes that had stolen my heart the moment I met him. I don't know how to say this without it sounding impossible, his voice cracked slightly, and that's when I knew something was wrong. My heart started to race, fear creeping in, but I didn't want to believe it. Not today, not in this perfect moment, what is it? I asked, forcing a smile. You're scaring me, he took a deep breath, his hand still holding mine as though he was afraid to let go. I've been offered a job, he said, pausing to let his words sink in. In New York, I blinked, trying to process the words. New York. Half a world away from our little village in France, where everything was familiar, safe. I had known that Laurent had big dreams, that his talent in architecture would take him far. But I had always imagined it would be somewhere we could still be together. Not separated by an ocean, for how long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. 2 years, he replied, wincing slightly as he said it. But if I do well, it could be longer. They're offering me a position that could define my entire career, I nodded, though my heart was screaming. That's amazing, Laurent, I managed to say, even as my world started to crumble. I'm so proud of you, but he could see through my bravado. He always could, Camille, don't think for a second that this changes anything between us, he said, gripping my hand tighter. We can make it work. I'll write to you every day. We'll talk on the phone, we'll visit each other whenever we can. I'll come back for you. I promise, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that love could conquer all, that we could survive the distance, the time apart. But deep down, a part of me was terrified. Terrified that the world was too big, and that love alone might not be enough, but we had to try. Because the alternative, losing him, was unthinkable, I promise too, I whispered, leaning in to kiss him. No matter how far away you go, I'll wait for you. We'll be together again. Nothing will change, we kissed under the oak tree, the weight of our promises hanging in the air. And in that moment, I believed it. I believed that love would be enough, but promises, I would soon learn, are fragile things, the weeks leading up to Laurent's departure were a blur of emotions. We spent every possible moment together, trying to soak up the time we had left. But no matter how many stolen kisses or whispered promises we shared, there was always an underlying sadness, a ticking clock that we couldn't escape, Laurent was scheduled to leave at the beginning of July. The thought of the date haunted me every night, like a countdown to the end of everything I had known. I tried to be brave for him, to show him that I could handle the distance, but every time we said goodbye, it felt like a small piece of me was breaking, the night before he left was unbearable. We had planned to spend it together, but the weight of what was coming crushed us. We didn't talk much, just held each other in silence. I memorized the feel of his arms around me, the scent of his skin, the way his breath felt against my hair, I love you, he whispered into the darkness, his voice trembling, I love you too, I whispered back, my throat tight with unshed tears. Don't forget me, I could never forget you, Camille, he said, pulling me closer. No matter where I go, you're always with me. Always, I closed my eyes, wishing I could freeze time, hold on to this moment forever. But time marched on, indifferent to our wishes, and morning came all too soon. We drove to the airport in silence, the tension between us palpable. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every beat a reminder that this was the last time we would be together for a long, long time. When we arrived, Laurent took my hand, pulling me close, this isn't goodbye, he said, his voice firm, though I could see the pain in his eyes. This is just a pause. I'll come back for you. I promise, I'll wait for you, I whispered, trying to hold back my tears, we kissed one last time, and then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of travelers, leaving me standing alone in the bustling airport, as I watched him go, a part of me wanted to run after him, to beg him to stay. But I knew I couldn't. This was his dream, and I had to let him chase it. So I stayed there, rooted to the spot, until he was completely out of sight, then, finally, I let the tears fall. At first, the distance didn't seem so insurmountable. Laurent and I wrote letters back and forth, pouring our hearts out onto paper, sharing every detail of our lives. I lived for his letters, waited for them with bated breath. Each one was like a lifeline, a reminder that he still loved me, that we were still connected despite the miles between us, his letters were filled with stories of New York, its towering buildings, its fast-paced life. He wrote about his job, how challenging and exciting it was, how he was learning so much. But no matter how much he loved the city, he always ended his letters the same way. I miss you, Camille. Every day. But we'll be together again soon, I clung to those words, reading and rereading them until they were imprinted on my mind. I missed him desperately, but I told myself that this was temporary. 2 years. We could survive that, couldn't we? The phone calls were harder. The time difference made it difficult to coordinate, and when we did manage to talk, there was always a delay in the line, a distance that made our conversations feel stilted, awkward. I tried to hide my loneliness, my fear that we were drifting apart, but I could hear it in Laurent's voice too. He was overwhelmed with work, with the pressure of his new job. He was trying so hard to make it all work, to keep our promise alive, but the strain was evident, still, I refused to give up. Love could conquer all, couldn't it? That's what I told myself, over and over, like a mantra. I threw myself into my own life, focusing on my studies, on my friends, trying to fill the void that Laurent had left behind. But no matter how busy I made myself, there was always an emptiness inside me, a longing for the man I loved, and then, one day, the letters stopped coming, at first, I didn't panic. I told myself that Laurent was just busy, that his work had gotten more demanding. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I tried calling him, but the calls went unanswered. I sent more letters, but there was no response. I reached out to his friends, to his family, but no one had heard from him in weeks. It was as if he had disappeared, the silence was unbearable. I felt like I was slowly losing my mind, consumed by worry and doubt. Had something happened to him? Had he moved on without telling me? The uncertainty gnawed at me, day and night, I tried to distract myself, to throw myself into my studies, into my friendships, but nothing worked. Everywhere I went, I saw reminders of Laurent, places we had gone together, things we had talked about, dreams we had shared. It was torture, a constant reminder of the love I had lost. I spent hours by the oak tree, our tree, staring out at the lake, willing him to return to me. But he never did, and then, one day, I received a letter. But it wasn't from Laurent, the letter was from Laurent's mother, Marie. When I saw her familiar handwriting on the envelope, my heart sank. I knew something was wrong. With shaking hands, I tore it open, scanning the words as my vision blurred with tears, Laurent had returned to France. He had come back to our village, but he hadn't contacted me. Instead, he had gone to see his family, staying with them in the countryside. Marie wrote that he seemed different, distant, as though something had changed in him during his time in New York. She didn't know what it was, but she could tell that he wasn't the same Laurent who had left 2 years ago, I felt a rush of hope. He was back. He was in France. But why hadn't he contacted me? Why hadn't he come to see me, to explain the silence? Had something happened to him in New York that he couldn't talk about? With my heart pounding, I packed a bag and took the first train to the countryside. I needed to see him, to understand what had happened. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last, when I arrived at Laurent's family home, Marie greeted me with a sad smile. She embraced me tightly, as though she knew how much I had suffered in his absence, he's out by the old barn, she said softly, her voice filled with sympathy. Go to him, Camille. He needs you, I nodded, my stomach twisting with anxiety. I made my way to the barn, my heart in my throat. And there he was, standing in the doorway, his back to me, staring out at the fields, Laurent, I whispered, my voice barely audible, he turned slowly, and when our eyes met, my heart shattered, Laurent was no longer the man I had fallen in love with. He looked older, wearier, as though the weight of the world had pressed down on him. But it wasn't just that. There was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't place. Regret. Guilt, Camille, he said, his voice hoarse. We stood there, staring at each other, the silence between us heavy with everything that had been left unsaid, Finally, I broke the silence. Why didn't you contact me? Why didn't you write? Laurent looked away, his jaw clenched. I couldn't, he said quietly. I couldn't face you after what happened, What happened? I demanded, my voice trembling with emotion. Laurent, I waited for you. I waited, and you disappeared, he closed his eyes, his face contorted with pain. I thought you had moved on, I blinked, stunned. Moved on? Why would you think that? I sent you letters, I called, I never got them, Laurent interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. I never got any of your letters, Camille. Not one, I stared at him, my mind reeling. But I sent them. I sent so many, Laurent shook his head, his expression tortured. Something happened, Camille. There's more you don't know. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Laurent's words hung in the air, heavy with implications I couldn't yet grasp. My mind was racing. How could he not have received my letters? I had poured my heart into them, written to him every week, and yet, how is that possible? I finally asked, my voice shaking. I sent them all to your New York address, the one you gave me before you left. I don't understand, Laurent sighed, running a hand through his hair, his face etched with frustration. I don't understand either, Camille. At first, I thought maybe they got lost in the mail, but when months went by and I heard nothing from you, I started to think that maybe you had decided to move on, I shook my head vehemently. No, Laurent, I never would have done that. I waited for you. Every single day, I waited, hoping to hear from you, but when your letters stopped coming, I didn't know what to think. I thought maybe you had forgotten about me, his eyes softened with pain, and for the first time since I had arrived, he stepped closer. Camille, I never forgot about you. I thought about you every day. But after a while, I convinced myself that maybe you were happier without me, tears filled my eyes as I listened to him, and the frustration and confusion I had bottled up for so long finally erupted. I wrote to you, Laurent. I wrote so many letters. And you never replied. How could you think that I had moved on? Laurent looked away, guilt flickering across his face. There's more, Camille, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Something happened in New York, something that changed everything, a chill ran down my spine as I watched him, waiting for him to continue. The Laurent standing before me wasn't the confident, ambitious man I had fallen in love with. He was haunted, broken. And whatever had happened in New York, it was clear that it had scarred him deeply, I need to know, I whispered, stepping closer, my heart pounding. Please, Laurent. Tell me what happened, Laurent's hands trembled slightly as he rubbed his forehead, as if gathering the strength to speak. There was someone else, he finally admitted, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did, the words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Someone else. My knees buckled slightly, and I had to steady myself against the barn door, my mind reeling, you were with someone else? I whispered, my voice cracking, Laurent nodded, his face contorted with shame. Her name was Isabelle. She worked at the same firm as me. At first, it was nothing. Just colleagues, you know? But as time went on, and I wasn't hearing from you, I started to feel lonely. And Isabelle, she was there, I felt like the ground was crumbling beneath me. After everything we had promised each other, after all the hope I had clung to, Laurent had been with someone else. The betrayal stung, cutting deeper than I could have imagined, it wasn't serious, Laurent continued, his voice pleading. I swear, Camille, I never loved her. But I was confused, and when she made it clear that she was interested in me, I let it happen. I didn't think I would ever hear from you again, I stared at him, my mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. The Laurent I had known was loyal, steady. How could he have done this? How could he have given up on us so easily? Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, because I was ashamed, he admitted, his eyes filled with guilt. By the time I realized my mistake, it was too late. I had already ended things with Isabel, but I couldn't bring myself to face you. I didn't know how to explain, how to tell you that I had failed you, I closed my eyes, the pain overwhelming me. The man I had loved for so long, the man I had waited for, had betrayed me with someone else. And yet, I still loved him. Despite everything, my heart still ached for him, I was going to tell you, Laurent said, stepping closer, his voice breaking. But when I came back to France, I found out something that changed everything, I looked up at him, my chest tight with emotion. What? Laurent hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to say the words that hung in the air. But then he spoke, and what he said next turned my world upside down, Isabel, she's pregnant, the world seemed to stop in that moment. I stared at Laurent, my mind struggling to process the words he had just said. Pregnant. The woman he had been with while I waited for him across the ocean was carrying his child, no. I whispered, my voice barely audible. This can't be happening, I didn't know how to tell you, Laurent continued, his voice breaking with anguish. I didn't even know she was pregnant until I came back to France. She contacted me just a few weeks ago, and when I found out, everything changed, I felt like I was drowning, the weight of his words pressing down on me from all sides. I had spent 2 years waiting for him, holding on to our promises, only to discover that he had been with someone else, someone who was now having his child, Camille, Laurent said softly, stepping closer, but I took a step back, shaking my head, don't, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Don't come any closer, he stopped, pain etched across his face, but I couldn't bear to look at him. My heart was shattered, and every part of me wanted to scream, to run, to escape the nightmare that had become my life, I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Laurent said, his voice thick with emotion. I made a mistake, Camille. A terrible mistake. But I swear to you, I never stopped loving you. Not for a second, how can you say that? I asked, my voice trembling with anger and hurt. How can you say you loved me when you were with someone else? I don't know, he admitted, tears glistening in his eyes. I don't have the answers. All I know is that I let you down, and I'm so sorry, I looked away, my chest heaving with sobs I was trying to suppress. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the fact that I had built my entire life around him, around our future together. And now, everything had crumbled, what happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Are you going to stay with her? With Isabel, Laurent shook his head, his face contorted with pain. No, I don't love her. We were over long before I found out she was pregnant. But now, I don't know what to do, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned away, my hands trembling as I wiped the tears from my face. You need to figure out your life, Laurent. You have a child on the way. That's bigger than us, bigger than anything we had planned, Camille, please, he pleaded, stepping closer again. I still want to be with you. I love you, I closed my eyes, his words tearing me apart. I can't, I whispered. Not right now. Not like this, and with that, I walked away, leaving behind the man I had once thought I would spend the rest of my life with, the days that followed were some of the hardest I had ever endured. I tried to go back to my normal life, to focus on my studies and my friends, but everything reminded me of Laurent. The letters I had kept in a drawer, the photos we had taken together, even the little cafe where we had spent so many afternoons talking about our future, it all felt like a cruel joke now, I had lost him. I had lost the life I had dreamed of, the future we had promised each other. And the worst part was that it wasn't just the betrayal that had broken me, it was the love I still felt for him, despite everything, but I knew I couldn't stay stuck in the past. I had to find a way to move forward. Even if it meant letting go of the man I had once believed was my forever. As the weeks passed, I threw myself into my work, trying to keep my mind off Laurent and everything that had happened. My friends were supportive, But they didn't know the full extent of the pain I was in. I kept most of it to myself, hiding the tears and the sleepless nights behind a mask of composure, but the truth was, I was lost, and then, one day, something unexpected happened. I was sitting in a cafe, sipping a coffee and trying to focus on a book, when a man approached me. He was tall, with dark hair and a kind smile, and there was something about him that felt different. Like he could see through the walls I had built around myself. Mind if I sit here? He asked, gesturing to the empty seat across from me. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Sure, we started talking, and before I knew it, hours had passed. His name was Adrian, and there was a warmth about him that made me feel at ease. For the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed. Really laughed, as the days turned into weeks, Adrian and I became close. He was kind, thoughtful, and supportive in a way that I hadn't realized I needed. He didn't push me to talk about Laurent, but somehow, he knew that I was healing from something painful. And he gave me the space to do that, without judgment, but as my feelings for Adrian grew, so did the guilt. Because no matter how hard I tried, a part of me still loved Laurent. As my friendship with Adrian blossomed, I found myself at a crossroads. There was a warmth in him, a gentle kindness that soothed the wounds I had carried for so long. We spent countless afternoons together, talking about everything from books to music, from travel to dreams. He had a way of making the world feel lighter, and being with him reminded me that life could be good again. But despite all that, Laurent's shadow loomed large in my heart. No matter how much time passed, no matter how many moments of joy Adrian brought into my life, I still felt the weight of my love for Laurent, buried beneath the rubble of betrayal and disappointment. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that I was moving on, that Adrian could be the fresh start I so desperately needed. But every time I laughed with Adrian, every time he held my hand or looked at me with those soft, understanding eyes, I felt the ghost of Laurent lingering in the back of my mind. And then one evening, everything came to a head, Adrian and I were having dinner at a cozy little bistro on the outskirts of town. The candlelight flickered between us, and there was an unspoken tension that had been building for weeks. I could see it in the way Adrian looked at me, his eyes full of something deeper than friendship. I knew what was coming. I could feel it in the way his fingers grazed mine as he reached for his glass, the way he leaned in just a little closer every time we spoke. Part of me wanted to let go of the past and fall into something new, something safe. But another part of me, perhaps the deeper, more wounded part, was still tangled in Laurent's world. Camille, Adrian said softly, setting down his glass and looking at me with an intensity one hadn't seen before. I've been meaning to tell you something, I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. What is it? He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. I care about you. A lot. More than I think I realized at first, I looked down at our hands, my mind spinning. I wanted to say something, but the words caught in my throat, Adrian continued, his voice low and sincere. I know you've been through a lot, and I don't want to rush anything. But I can't help how I feel. I'm falling for you, Camille. And I need to know if there's a place for me in your life, his words hung in the air, and for a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. This was it, the moment I had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. I could feel the weight of his emotions, the vulnerability in his voice. But beneath that, there was a truth I couldn't ignore, before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at the screen, and my heart sank, it was a message from Laurent, please, Camille. I need to see you. It's important, I felt my world tilt, the ground shifting beneath me. Adrian noticed the change in my expression, and his brow furrowed with concern. Is everything okay? I hesitated, staring at the message, unsure of what to do. Finally, I looked up at Adrian, my voice shaking slightly. It's Laurent, the name seemed to hit him like a punch. He nodded slowly, his face falling. I see, for a long moment, we sat in silence. Adrian didn't say anything, but I could feel the tension between us, thick and unspoken, I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can move on. Not yet, Adrian's eyes softened, though I could see the hurt in them. You have to figure out what's right for you, Camille. I just hope I hope that you know what we have is real, I nodded, guilt twisting in my chest. I know it is. But I need time. Adrian smiled sadly, releasing my hand. I understand. Just don't keep me waiting too long, I watched him leave the restaurant, my heart heavy with conflicting emotions. I knew I had to confront Laurent. There was something unfinished between us, something that needed to be resolved before I could fully let go. But I also knew that I was at risk of losing Adrian, the man who had become a beacon of light in my darkest moments, and so, with a deep breath, I stood up and made my way to the oak tree. Our oak tree. The place where everything had begun, the night was crisp and cool, a gentle breeze stirring the leaves as I made my way to the oak tree by the lake. My heart raced with every step, a mix of dread and anticipation flooding my senses. Laurent was waiting for me, just as he always had been. But this time, everything was different. When I arrived, he was standing with his back to me, gazing out at the water. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if I should turn back, if facing him again was the right thing to do. But I couldn't leave things unresolved. Not this time, Laurent, I called softly, he turned at the sound of my voice, and for a brief moment, the sight of him took my breath away. He looked tired, older somehow, but there was still something undeniably familiar about him. The way his eyes met mine, the way his presence filled the space between us, it was as if no time had passed at all, Camille, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for coming, I nodded, wrapping my arms around myself as if to ward off the cold. What's going on, Laurent? Why did you want to meet? He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you from the beginning, I tensed, bracing myself for whatever bombshell he was about to drop. What is it? Laurent hesitated, his expression pained. Isabelle, she's not pregnant, the words hit me like a slap to the face. I blinked, struggling to process what I had just heard. What? She lied, he continued, his voice raw. She told me she was pregnant to keep me from leaving her. I believed her, Camille. I thought I had to stay with her because of the baby. But it was all a lie, I stared at him, my mind spinning. So, there's no baby? He shook his head, guilt and frustration etched across his face. No. There's no baby. She admitted it to me after I confronted her a few weeks ago. She knew I was still in love with you, and she didn't want to lose me, my emotions whirled in a chaotic storm. Relief, anger, confusion, it all hit me at once. The thought of Isabelle lying about something so monumental was appalling, but at the same time, it changed everything. Laurent wasn't tied to her, wasn't going to be a father after all. But that didn't erase the fact that he had been with her. It didn't undo the hurt that had already been caused, you stayed with her because of a lie, I said, my voice shaking. But you still chose her. You still let it happen, I know, Laurent said, stepping closer, his eyes pleading. I made a mistake, Camille. A huge mistake. But I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I'm just asking for a chance. A chance to make things right, I looked away, my heart aching. I don't know if I can trust you again, Laurent. I don't know if I can go through this all over again, he reached out, gently touching my arm. I understand. But I need you to know that I love you, Camille. I always have. And I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you. For a long moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of everything between us pressing down. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to fall back into the comfort of the love we had shared. But another part of me, perhaps the stronger part, knew that trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild, I need time, I whispered, my voice breaking. I need to figure out what I really want, Laurent nodded, his expression filled with understanding. Take all the time you need. I'll wait for you, Camille. No matter how long it takes, as I walked away from the oak tree that night, I realized something important. I was no longer the same girl who had made that promise under the branches so many years ago. I had changed, grown. And now, I had to decide what my future would look like, whether that future included Laurent or not, The following weeks were a blur of emotions, each day a struggle between my heart and my mind. Adrian had given me space, though I knew he was waiting for an answer, I spent hours walking through the village, trying to clear my head, But no matter how far I walked, the weight of the decision pressed down on me. Laurent had been my first love, my everything. But he had also hurt me, shattered my trust. Could I ever really go back to him? Could we ever rebuild what had been lost? And then there was Adrien, steady, kind, and patient. He didn't have the history that Laurent and I shared, but maybe that was a good thing. He represented something new, something untarnished by the past. With him, I could start fresh, leave behind the pain and confusion that had defined so much of my relationship with Laurent. But did I love him? I wasn't sure. And that was the problem. One evening, I found myself back at the cafe where Adrien and I had first met. The place was nearly empty, the sun setting outside. I sat down in a quiet corner, my heart heavy with indecision. As I sat there, lost in thought, the door opened, and Adrien walked in. Our eyes met across the room, and I could see the question in his gaze, the question he hadn't yet asked, but that I knew was coming. He approached slowly, sitting down across from me, his expression unreadable. "Camille," he said softly. "I've been giving you space, like you asked. But I need to know, where do we stand?" I looked down at the table, my stomach churning. "Adrien, I don't know." He nodded, his face calm, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. "I understand. But I need you to be honest with me, Camille. Do you still have feelings for Laurent?" The question hung in the air, and for a long moment, I didn't answer. Finally, I looked up at him, my heart breaking. "I don't know if I can let him go." Adrien sighed, leaning back in his chair, his jaw clenched. "I can't compete with your history, Camille. I know that. But I thought, maybe we could build something new together. We could," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But I don't know if it's fair to you. I don't know if I'm ready." Adrien looked away, his expression pained. "I've waited for you, Camille. But I can't wait forever." I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. "I know." Silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Adrien stood up, his face etched with sadness. "I care about you, Camille. But I can't be second place in your heart. If you choose Laurent, then I hope he makes you happy. But if you ever decide you want something real, something new, you know where to find me." And with that, he walked out of the cafe, leaving me alone once again. Before you leave, remember to subscribe.